All right, so this is what are we on, like episode 8 or 7?
I think this is seven.
All right, so welcome back if you're a returning listener. And I guess go ahead. You were saying
So
about Buddhism.
there's a couple topics that I've been studying for myself existentially in my own experience of life that the Buddhist philosophy probably addresses. And you were expressing interest in discussing some of the characteristics of the Buddhist philosophy. We could discuss that if that happens to pertain or relate to the part of Buddhism you were wanting to talk about.
Well, we've been talking a lot about like existentialism. I think it's had like a very like Western perspective on it, right? Maybe
Yeah,
because a lot of the ideas I'm talking about come from like Ernest Becker and Otto Rank, Kierkegaard, Nietzsche, these kind of people. But so basically, we were talking about the fear of death, right? How our awareness of death triggers our sort of limbic system into kind of this constant stream of anxiety, angst about dying, right? And then there's a lot of discomfort or guilt associated with having free will and being responsible for creating meaning, you know, and 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 inching out or trying to sort of build a worldview. And so what we do in exchange for our own personal freedom, give that up in exchange for a ready-made worldview, right? A cultural worldview that provides us with a sense of meaning if we participate in
right.
it, right? And we do good. We gain a sense of self-worth and self-esteem from our compliance, for our, what's it called? Conformity, right? And
Conform.
yeah, and then there's some anxiety reducing aspects to culture. But in Buddhism, like, so they have methods developed to deal with all these existential problems that we're dealing with that sort of transcend culture as we've been talking about. They're all like very sort of like different sorts of mental practices, right? So
Right.
each of the existential issues, like say the fear of death or even the fear of will, is dealt with in a certain way. So the concentration meditation, for example, is really good for becoming more comfortable with will. It's actually a form of like will therapy if you think about it, because if you're trying to keep your attention on your breath or an object or something like that, you have to recognize when your concentration has gone off, and then you have to use will to bring it back, right? And so you're constantly
Sure.
exercising a sense of will and overcoming impulses in the process of bringing your attention back,
Right.
right? And so that one, it strengthens your ability to sort of impose your will on your own behavior and over your body and limbic system and stuff like that.
Would you say that that's kind of like a calisthenics for willpower,
Yeah,
the
exactly.
strength of will?
Right. And that's what concentration meditation is all about, right? And
Yeah.
so they
Right.
also have compassion meditation is like an equal part of the practice, where basically all you do is you try to conjure up like something that makes you feel warm and fuzzy, like a image of a puppy or like
Yeah.
a newborn baby and something like that. And you start to sort of analyze, the things you might do to protect the baby if it was in danger, or if it was hurt, how bad you would feel for it. If a train was coming from it or something like that, you would pick it up and get it out of the way, right? And so you try to focus on all these feelings you have, something that's really easy to feel compassion for, like a baby or a puppy or something.
Yeah. Something that we're already wired to have that neurotransmitter response, because that's basically what the warm fuzzy feeling is the presence of neurotransmitters.
Yeah, oxytocin or something like that. Yeah,
Yeah, dopamine, oxytocin, and serotonin.
yeah. And
There's a
then
whole group of them.
and then in that practice, they once they have that feeling, sort of in their consciousness, they try to expand it to people they feel neutral about. Maybe a neighbor, or maybe an acquaintance or someone at work or something like that, right? Someone you wouldn't normally have this feeling of compassion for, this sort of sense of urgency about protecting and stuff like that. You try to expand that feeling towards people you feel neutral about. And then the next stage would be to try to expand that feeling, if you could hold on to it, to people that you don't like, who have wronged you in some way, or evil characters in the culture
You
or
can
something
change.
like that.
You can change how you feel about them.
Right. And then finally, you do it to the entire universe, right? Just have this generalized feeling of compassion and a generalized feeling of urgency towards protecting the universe from suffering, right? And so that's like also there. But what that does is it provides you with a sense of meaning or self-esteem that's not symbolic, right? So just the act
Okay,
of
back up. Repeat that. I want to make sure I got it.
so it provides you with a sense of meaning or purpose or a sense of self-esteem, self-confidence, centeredness,
Yeah,
without it being symbolic, right? So like
it's not. It's non-symbolic.
right, and it's not dependent on like a negation object, or it's not dependent on comparing yourself to other people, like in the culture. So in a cultural worldview, like in the United States, for example, we use consumerism as our culture for the most part, right? So the person with the biggest house and the nicest car, and the biggest ornamental surplus is a person who gains his sense of self-worth, right? But it's dependent on these sort of symbolic achievements within
Yeah.
the culture.
Well, is it possible that it's still symbolic, but a very different kind of symbolism, a different symbolic reality? Maybe it's a more functional, more sane symbolic reality, but it still has symbolism in it, or
No, I don't think so. It's not like a function of heroism or anything like that. It's just being kind for whatever reason makes people less anxious, less depressed, more self-confident, more self-aware. It's like where you don't need a symbolic sort of cultural system to sort of handle your existential needs. All you have to do is you practice like compassion, right? Or compassion meditation, whatever.
yeah, and maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe my question isn't pertinent in that the answer to my question doesn't matter. What matters is that we find a way of being that is more sane for us, more peace of mind, more wisdom, making better choices. Would be I see those as being the consequences of having the ability to will compassion.
Right.
And because how it is for most of us most of the time now is some people we have compassion for, and other people we're indifferent to. Even occasionally, for some of us, we actually hate people. We will them harm, not well-being, right?
Right.
But it's just random. It's purely spontaneous, and it just happens. And it's back to the what you call the reflexive kind of thing. There's little or no will applied to compassion or hate or indifference. It just happens. And so what you're presenting here is the possibility of using the Buddhist tradition to develop will to compassion instead of will to power.
Yeah. Well.
Will to the power of compassion.
Yeah. Well, there's separate issues. Like one of them is the existential guilt, right? Which being uncomfortable with your own will, and that has to do with being in a state of stimulus and response for a few billion years as we evolved from single-celled organisms to all of a sudden having this space between stimulus and response and having this ego that problem solves, right?
Yeah.
And so there's an incredible amount of disorientation, discomfort, not being able to just live reflexively and having this gap between stimulus and response, right? So in Buddhism, by doing the concentration meditation, you actually just a lot of this stuff we're talking about has to do with anxiety, right? And if you look
using what?
A lot of the stuff we're talking about, like the fear of death and guilt and all that kind of stuff, they're different qualities of anxiety, I think.
Sure.
And the best treatment for anxiety is cognitive behavioral, right? And the behavioral aspect of that is just confrontation, where you confront the fear, right? and as you continuously confront the fear or experience the thing you're afraid of, like heights and stuff like that, and you don't die, right? Then that anxiety tends to dissipate for people who have phobias and stuff.
Right. That's the cognitive behavioral therapy method is what you're talking about.
Right. And so
Right.
that's the same issue when you're doing concentration meditation. The whole point is to impose your will, right? To control your impulses, control your body. And as you become more and more exposed to being willful, your anxiety levels about that are naturally going to decrease, just because you're becoming desensitized to the anxiety, I guess, about it. And because
Well, what happens is, I think, back to what I've learned from squirrels, is how quickly they return to homeostasis,
right,
to peace of mind. So something happens that startles them. Their nervous system responds to it as a threat, and away they go. And then it only takes them a few minutes, and they're back out sunning themselves on the rocks.
mm-hmm.
So I think what happens neurologically is that the synapses kind of normalize. Without continued stimulus, they stop responding. Whereas in the human brain, we can capture images, and our nervous system will continue to respond to those images of threat, even if they don't. Back to symbolic, they're a symbolic threat.
Yeah, there's a constant stream of angst.
Yeah, and so we can hold on to, when something happens, we can hold on to the symbolic meaning of that thing that causes us to continue to be anxious. Whereas I observed in the critters, they don't seem to have that mechanism, that neurological mechanism. Also, like with the deer, something will happen and they'll be startled, and a lot of the times they won't just run off completely. They'll take about 5 or 6 steps and stop and do a double check. And then if it's me walking out the door, they recognize that they have some kind of a record of me not being a threat. So it is as though they recognize, I don't know how much cognition there is involved, but it is as though they recognize, oh, well, he lives here, it's not a problem. And then they go back to doing whatever they were doing. In that case, they don't even run all the way across and get into their burrow like the squirrels do. They just go a few steps, and the nervous system relaxes. Whereas with us human beings, there's 2 things going on. One is all of the images that are constantly being presented to us all around us. It's like we're swimming in a cesspool of fear-mongering images, and but then there's also our own story that we have about everything that happens, that is a constant anxiety stimulus. So that's kind of. Does that fit within what you were just saying? I'm trying to paraphrase what I understood you to say.
Well, I was made 2 points. One was about existential guilt, and one was about existential anxiety.
Uh-huh.
And the part relating to the compassion meditation was related to the existential anxiety, that constant stream of angst.
Right.
And that constant stream of angst is buffered, I guess, with the compassion meditation. I think the existential, the fear of death kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, because I think it brings focus to what we're stimulating our mind with, and we go from a random stimulus response to a willful, intentional use or application of this part of our nervous system that gives us peace of mind or gives us anxiety. Right? It's like we can will our mental well-being by practicing the loving kindness meditation.
Yeah. Yeah, and we can conquer our existential guilt by practicing like concentration meditation. But there's another meditation they do too, along with the compassion, is they will visualize everyone that they love, their children, their wives, and they'll visualize them on their deathbed and then dying,
Uh-huh.
and then their bodies rotting away, becoming skeletons, and the skeletons turning to dust, right?
Right. Yeah.
They're exposing themselves to loss, right? The loss of their loved ones in order to try to uh, buffer the anxiety around loss. Not just your own death, but the death of the people you're attached to.
Right.
It's supposed to help with attachment. So it's the same sort of thing. It's kind of a cognitive behavioral therapy that they use in order to, reduce their anxiety about loss. So it's like all these different things that we have, that we're talking about, that Western philosophy does a really good job of articulating. They've been able to articulate it, and they've been able to develop a system to sort of cure yourself.
To address it.
Right, yeah.
Right.
This is really interesting.
Yeah, and from over 2,000 years ago.
Right, yeah, from way before our Western philosophers, yeah.
This is what we just referenced right there. To me, is an example of the merits of direct observation, of direct self-reflection. In other words, even a science, because I see it as a science, as a way of knowing, is to just look at our own being and observe through deep meditation. Over time, we can begin to notice things about what we're up to, how our brain works, how our nervous system works. Even if you have no knowledge of neurology, you can still see how your mind is functioning.
Yeah, I saw a conversation between the Dalai Lama and a neuroscientist, or no, he was a cognitive psychologist or something like that. I forget which one he was, but yeah, they were having a conversation, and then the Dalai Lama was explaining. I don't know. I've talked about this before. How there's a lot of different minds going on at once inside your brain.
Right.
Like your pieces of you that concentrate, and then different parts that analyze. There's a bunch of different minds, right? And so
Right.
the Dalai Lama was talking about that, and how that all that's in the Buddhist philosophy, and then the cognitive scientist was like blown away because that's what they're discovering. All the things he's talking about
Right.
in modern cognitive sciences, right? Yeah, that there's all these different cognitive pieces that are taking place simultaneously, but they tend to be unified into a singular sort of experience or identity, even though there's like a lot of different ones.
Right.
Yeah. So yeah, they were talking about that, and so even that kind of stuff is, goes way back thousands of years in like Buddhist philosophy or even like Hindu and stuff like that.
Right.
Yeah. So, yeah. And then
there's a lot of work being done. In fact, you were the one that first mentioned this to me at Stanford, the Care Center.
it's like Center for Altruism or something like that.
Yeah. The
Altruistic
Center for
Studies.
Compassion, Altruism, and Education. CARE, CCARE, and so they're doing a lot of research with neurology on what's going on neurologically with these various experiences that humans are capable of having, and so we're finding out the biological explanation for what Siddhartha, being the first of the Buddhist tradition, his enlightenment, and what he discovered intuitively through intuitive mysticism and direct observation with intuition. So he didn't have an elaborate explanation of the biology behind the conclusions that he came to. As is the case with intuition, it often gives us conclusions without an explanation of how we arrive at that conclusion. But the fact that now we're finding out through modern science, neurologically, how all this happens, that the what Buddhism is based on certain experiences, and how those experiences happen neurologically is what we're beginning to understand. So it gives a modern science explanation, and for a lot of people, that's credibility to the ancient teachings. But I think it illustrates that there's something in the ancient teachings, this intuitive insight capacity, a primitive wisdom, we might say, that is turning out to be much more valid than what modern academia has, for the last couple hundred years, has been willing to give credit to.
Yeah, and then they also have, so besides like the visualization and the meditation, they also say that the study of philosophy is very important too, or not just philosophy, learning about biology, physics, learning as much as you can about like science and the world.
Right.
Is also important, right? Because as you reduce sort of like the guilt and existential angst and stuff like that, these are sort of the motivating forces that create all the cultural delusion, right?
Right.
So as the cultural delusion is dissipating, or you don't have such a strong need for the cultural worldview, you also have to study at the same time, right, and try to get a grasp on what reality is. So you're almost like eliminating a bias at the same time as trying to educate yourself on the nature of reality, right? And so like, I think one of the most interesting philosophers in Buddhism is this guy named Nagarjuna. He wrote a script called Fundamental Wisdom of the Middle Way. It's been translated to English, and I have it. It's very interesting because all it is it's like a repetitive sort of examples of like, so like there is no seer without the seen, right? There is no seen without the seer, right? And it's just like it's a bunch of examples trying to have you have an intuitive or an experiential sort of insight about the nature of like contingency, where everything is interdependent and depends on everything else for its own identity, and nothing exists in isolation.
Everything is relative.
Right. Well, nothing exists in isolation. You exist, but only as, a piece of an interdependent sort of system,
as a part of a larger whole.
Yeah, but what's interesting is it's like, because that's not hard to understand on an intellectual level, right? That interdependent identities are interdependent. Like, there is no seer without the seen, right? Because there's nothing to see, you can't have a seer, right? And then you can't be seen if there's no such thing as a seer, right? So these two concepts are completely dependent on each other, right? But there's the reason why it's repetitive, I think, is because you're supposed to have some sort of profound insight about the nature of reality, right? An experiential insight. And so they're also very good at understanding the difference between a cognitive level of understanding and experiential or intuitive levels of understanding.
Now, when you say cognitive level, this would be at the concepts, ideas, images.
Yeah, like linear understanding,
even symbols would be part of that. Cognitive.
Like logic, you can understand something on a logical level, right?
Yeah.
But what they feel like is like the logical understanding is only there as a means to sort of achieving an experiential insight, where you understand, you experience the nature of something in reality.
Right. Yeah, that goes back to the direct observation. Right. Where you see, and it's called insight, to see inside of, what we're looking at. In this case, it's mostly the self that we're looking at, right? And to have that straight, direct experience of it. And I like what you're presenting here, because I think it's a very significant thing. Too often, we substitute the ideas and the concepts of reality for the reality. So we have a full-on experience of the picture of something, but we miss the something that it's a picture of. Similar to like the menu and the meal. We have a full-on experience of a menu, but we fail to use the menu to get to the meal.
Right.
Is that hooking up with what you were just saying?
No, exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, right. I was looking for like paraphrasing. And I think that's really a significant thing for human well-being, is to be able to differentiate the idea of something, the idea of the apple, and to recognize that that's not the same thing as the apple. That the apple pre-exists the idea of it.
Right.
It's like it pre-exists as in the apple sits on the table and it's there whether I look at it or not, and whether I think about it or not. I think about it in my mind, but that's not actually smelling or tasting the apple.
Yes.
And that what life has to offer is the opportunity to taste life, have that direct experience that I'm thinking that I picked up as what you were referring to.
Right. There's a reality of interdependency that you can experience that exists separate from the concept of logical understanding of interdependency and what that means by definition.
Yeah.
I think Western culture puts most of the emphasis on like logical understanding, and I think maybe even de-emphasizes experiential or intuitive insight.
Well, certainly modern culture, even now postmodern culture, I would say, beginning with the Enlightenment in the 1700s, or was it the late 1600s? But anyway, that period of time that's referred to as the age of reason and enlightenment, it's as though we fell in love with abstract thought. And we've had this intellectual love affair with abstract thought at the expense of being able to taste the nectar of life, the realness of what's going on. And not just in our relationship with what's around us, but where I think it's really critical is that we don't taste the nectar of our own being, the bitterness and the sweetness of it all, of the I am, of my own being. I'm left with only my thoughts and ideas, and then the stories I make up out of that stuff, and then all the existential angst that comes out of that story that I make up, or all of the denial of the angst from the stories that I make up about the ideas about myself, right? Rather than really being able to fully experience my own being. Am I making any sense there?
Yeah. And then there's an interesting Nietzsche, like Friedrich Nietzsche. I can't remember what books he wrote it in, but he had this warning about I think he called it profundity.
Profundity?
Yeah, profoundity,
yeah.
Profundity.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
So, and if you can maybe differentiate between the feeling of something being profound,
right,
and like an experiential insight, right? Because they seem very similar, but what he warns about is that, so taking into consideration all of our biases and existential needs and all this kind of stuff, right? When a concept has a high potential for meaning and purpose, but lacks a logical connections,
right.
doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Right.
One of the ways we bridge the gap of something not being logical,
is not making sense.
Yeah, we have this experience of it being profound, right? And so if we can have this emotional, profound experience, we can convince ourselves that we have done our due diligence logically and it all makes sense, and we can just sort of ignore the inconsistencies while reaping the benefits of its, its
Yeah.
meaning making potential, right? So
We get seduced by the dopamine in that, I think.
you're right.
There's a lot of dopamine in what you're just now describing. And I think that that's one of the things that modern human beings haven't really come to terms yet with, is that, a life without dopamine isn't worth living, but a life driven by dopamine is an intoxicated, addicted state of being.
Well, that's what schizophrenia is, right? It's the overproduction of dopamine. Isn't that what it is?
I'm not familiar with that particular
Yeah,
part, but
because,
it's consistent with what I do know about dopamine and schizophrenia. I mean, it, as you were saying, it makes sense. It adds up
Yeah.
in my way of thinking. But you bring up a very interesting point there, personally for me, because just recently I've been hanging out with or studying something that you just kind of referred to indirectly in what you just said about the profundancy.
Profundity or whatever. I forget what term he used. Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's a good term. I think it works for what we're saying here, because in profundancy, there's neurotransmitters involved with profundancy. Profundancy is like beauty, or
Yeah.
pleasure,
Yeah.
or any other kinds of qualities of experiences that we have. It's an energetic experience. It's not just the object that we consider to be profound that is the experience of profundancy. So it's like beauty's in the eye of the beholder. Well, profundancy is in the eye of the beholder also, I think. And there's a neurological footprint to all of those experiences of beauty and pleasure, profundancy, and then the list could go on and on. But I think there's a neurological footprint in the form of neurotransmitters. The presence of neurotransmitters they're involved with having that experience. So when we have that experience, where as my understanding is that there will be neurotransmitters that are facilitating that experience.
Yeah. You know what's interesting too is like, because I don't know if you've never smoked weed, right? But being high on marijuana,
Right.
that's kind of the high. You're in this constant state of being profound. Everything's trippy. Whoa, man. You know what I mean? It's like
Yeah,
you're
yeah.
high, but it's like you have this experience of being, everything's profound. And we have natural cannabinoid receptors in our brains, so they must have some sort of, there must be some, I don't know, we must have some natural cannabinoid neurotransmitters, because we have those receptors outside of, like, smoking weed or whatever. So
Right.
I wonder if cannabinoids are natural, that we produce naturally, have something to do with that experience of something being profound, because it's very similar.
Well, I think it has everything to do with it. We're also talking about the awe of a sunset. Right now in Yosemite, the water is just going crazy, the snow melt, and all the waterfalls that are normally not there. And, it takes the Yosemite Valley to a whole new level of awesome.
Well, that's awe, what you're talking about. Awe, or
Awe,
like an
yeah, awesome.
aesthetic experience, right? So I think it's different than what the profundity that I'm talking about.
How do you see it as different? What's the distinction?
Because it's related to, like, concepts. When something is profound, like, it's profound on an intellectual level.
Well, okay, I get a distinction there. Awe is a word that belongs, what you're proposing here is that it's a word that belongs more to the observance of, like, a sunset, or
Yeah.
we have oak trees up here that are, over 150 years old, that are just majestic. They're majesty. There's another profundancy type word, right? And awesome. So what those code noises called words, what they're referring to is a particular configuration of neurotransmitters,
Okay.
and we're having this experience because of those neurotransmitters.
No, maybe I think you're right actually, because what you're saying makes a lot of sense. Because because what we do is we hijack a lot of our natural sort of experiences for the symbolic stuff, right?
Oh yeah.
So I guess,
and we use the symbolic to try and replicate what can otherwise be done by nature.
Yeah. So it could just be, yeah, you're right, like where we are able to hijack that, whatever that all is, or that ecstatic, experience in our intellectual sort of undertakings, to try to force in concepts that may not be, exactly correct, but have
well, in some cases, very erroneous concepts.
Right.
And so what comes to mind here is the indigenous peoples have had rituals for sanctifying these experiences that we're talking about. So the majesty of nature, the profundancy of nature, to have the experience of that, and the certainty and absoluteness of the experience that we take away from those experiences. Traditionally, they've been used in a spiritual or religious sort of way to maintain a sacred relationship with nature. And one of the rituals, one type of ritual that is used was hallucinogenics. And in the teachings of Don Juan, there was a lot of detail about the ritual procedure for the taking of mescaline and peyote. And I noticed in there that it seemed like that the teacher was very adamant about a certain way of setting the stage for that high experience that the hallucinogenics would bring. And that it was great trouble if you didn't follow the procedure. Yeah. And so that leads me to believe that in these ancestral ways of managing our mental states, particularly the neurotransmitters, they understood that there could be a very profane way of achieving the high. Mm-hmm. And that what made it profane is that it would rob you of the full benefit of what that high can be as a religious experience. So they wanted to keep it in the context. It seemed to me, it seemed to me that they wanted to keep that religious high in a context of something sacred, so it didn't end up getting used in a self-destructive way.
Yeah,
and this is all led by the
shaman,
the shaman and their intuitive sense of how to use this. That whatever that's been discovered. Let's just take peyote for example, and you can enrich your life. You can deal with all sorts of existential issues in your religion and use the peyote as a way of doing that. But there's a serious downside to it, that if you don't keep it in the right context, if you don't keep it in a sacred context where it has certain significance to it, then you could end up using it in a self-destructive way. And I think that our modern marketing is just a giant example, thanks to Bernays. Is that who it was?
Edward Bernays. That's Freud's nephew.
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. And that our whole marketing system is designed to use that manipulation of the neurotransmitters, to use the neurotransmitters in a way to just separate people from their money without any regard to the unhealthy consequences to humanity or the planet.
Well, can I make a point on what you're saying before?
Yeah,
Let's take a
right.
couple steps back, because you said like about how that profundity, in the wrong context can be harmful, right?
Right.
And I think that, and that's exactly I think what Nietzsche was warning about. So if we go a few decades later, or a century, or however long it was, to like behaviorism and the concept of classical conditioning, right?
Uh-huh.
So if you associate, like with mice, when they're every time that you feed them, I don't know, some peanut butter or something, you ring a bell. Pretty soon you'll be able to ring that bell, and they'll start salivating as if they were going to eat, even if you don't supply the food, right? So
Yeah,
there's
well,
an
that's
association.
Pavlov's dogs, right?
Classical conditioning, right? So if you
Yeah.
if you associate a concept with this profound experience that leaves a lasting imprint on you,
Yeah.
but the concept associated is incorrect,
Uh-huh.
or leads you in the wrong direction. Yeah, that can be very
Well, yeah,
harmful, right?
it leads you in an unhealthy direction.
Right. So I just wanted to make that
the,
point. It's
I
like
don't know that
classical
the
conditioning.
accuracy. I don't know that the accuracy is critical. You made a very important point in one of our prior conversations that evolution it favors suitability, not accuracy.
Yeah,
And
fitness
I've
over
thought
accuracy.
about that, and I think that I think that's a significant variable. So even here, as we're talking about this, it the symbol, it doesn't have to be accurate, but what matters is it healthy? Does it move us in a direction that supports our well-being, or is it moving us in a direction to self-destruction?
Well, I originally brought this up because Nietzsche is talking about giving this warning about profundity,
Right.
because this is in the context of understanding reality and perceiving truth, right?
Right.
Yeah. So whatever, the pursuit of truth or pursuit of reality.
Right.
And so, like, going back to what the Buddhists, they put a lot of emphasis of having these strong experiential insights, right?
Uh-huh.
And so I was just bringing Nietzsche up as sort of this sort of contribution from Western thought that could, maybe help you along also in this Eastern sort of practice. That, yeah, this experiential thing is very important, but you have to have your guards up that, you're not like just tricking yourself into believing something
Exactly.
because it has a high potential for cultural significance or something.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
So you have to, kind of keep that in mind too, I think.
Yeah, I see a corollary between what you just said there and what I took away from the study of the indigenous practices of with peyote and et cetera, where I think it comes back to context. We have to pay attention to context, because the context is what our neurotransmitters respond to. They respond to the meaning and significance of things that we observe, the symbolic meaning or literal meaning. I don't think our neuron system distinguishes all that much. It just so
Yeah. Otherwise,
it can get
culture would not be
crossed
selected.
up right there.
Yeah. So that's interesting. So it's like when you say context, we can see it as kind of a filter that you create
Sure.
yourself, right? And so
Right.
everything you perceive sort of like passes through this filter. It becomes contextualized in a certain way.
Exactly.
Right. So yeah. So if you can take a very dangerous environment, right, but you contextualize it into being harmless, even though reality might be dangerous, your biology isn't going to respond to that environment as if it was dangerous, because you've created this cultural, or you could say contextual filter for yourself, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah.
To illustrate what you just said, watching videos on YouTube of visits to the zoo, and so there's this little toddler sitting in front of the glass window with in the tiger enclosure, right? And the tiger starts stalking toward. It's clear across on the other side of the enclosure, right? And it starts approaching this toddler that's sitting on the ground, on the floor in front of this glass, right? And it comes up there, and then as it approaches very, very slowly, it sees a meal. Its context is there's something to eat there, and it leaps for the child, and of course hits the glass, and slides down. The child is oblivious. The context of the child is no harm here. It's the child's nervous system is treating that situation as harmless. Well, in this particular case, it probably is harmless because the glass is pretty strong. But what that illustrates, though, is how even if there's no glass there, we can be in the context and be in harm's way without being aware, without responding to it, because we've put ourselves in a bubble. And back to the modern marketplace is that even myself, I find myself wanting to buy stuff that isn't contributing to my well-being. It might be contributing to my immediate scratching the itch of consumerism, because I have somewhere in my psyche, in subconscious, I have all of this modern stuff that we all have, keeping up with the Joneses, the symbolism, and I get the neurotransmitter response to, wouldn't it be cool if it was this or if it was that, right? Or even unrelated to the market, I have ideals about my garden and how I want the garden to look, and even that can become a pot party, so to speak, where I get so involved in the high about how the garden could be, and I completely miss what it tastes like the way it is, the goodness of what it is, right? Because I'm preoccupied with the possibility of what it could be.
Yeah,
because of the neurotransmitters, the high that I get out of thinking about that.
Well, you got to do something, right? And so being satisfied with it how it is doesn't, create much potential for action. You gotta
Well,
do something
it doesn't. In fact, contentment is the enemy of modern industry.
Yeah, then you get bored.
Yeah. Well, but is boredom bad? Yes, is there anything inherently bad about boredom? If I'm bored, like the child was bored about the tiger, right? If I'm bored about things that are a threat to my well-being, that if I'm bored about things that and I have plenty of things that are important to me, important to my well-being that I'm bored about, like exercising enough to get my weight down, which you're way ahead of me on that one. Congratulations.
Well, I kind of plateaued, so I just started weightlifting again. So
did you?
Yeah, I'm staying. I feel I'm still losing fat, but I'm kind of staying the same weight now because I'm putting on muscle mass.
Yeah, right. Well, and the thing is, I don't know that the weight in and of itself is anything other than an arbitrary reference point. What matters is to be at a healthy weight.
Yeah, all of my stuff, cholesterol, blood pressure, blood sugar, all that is back down to normal now.
Is it?
Well within normal now, yeah.
Yeah, well, great.
Yeah.
So, your work with your weight, which is really with your body health, right? Your physical health. It's an example, or it can be an example of everything we've just been talking about in the abstract. It can be where the rubber meets the road of all these ideas that we've just been exchanging.
Well, it's a practical, taking some action to better your health, right? It's something practical, not symbolic or cultural to focus on.
It's your physical well-being is a very real thing.
Right.
That it exists without any symbols or abstraction of any kind to represent it, right? And what you've done is you have engaged the part of reality that is your physical well-being. You're mentally and emotionally and behaviorally interacting with that part of reality that is your body. That strikes me as being pretty transcendent of concepts and ideas, more directly.
Yeah. What's interesting is like when you lift weights too, you're sore a lot, right? So your chest is sore, your back,
Yeah,
your stomach,
yeah.
and stuff like that. And so since you can feel your body, normally you can't feel your body, right? Because
Yeah.
But with being sore, you can feel your body. And Jennifer's been lifting weights with me. She says the same thing. She can feel her body, and she feels more grounded somehow and more in her body with the weightlifting because she can constantly feel herself, which is
Well,
it's
and
interesting.
that's
Yeah.
where yoga, as a spiritual and health well-being practice, it's my understanding that's what yoga is getting at, is a being in our body and sensing the reality of our own physical being, rather than just our own "I think, therefore I am." It's experiencing the self as the meal, not the menu.
I think
Uh,
I want to do one of those float tanks. Have you heard of those?
Say again.
The float tanks, the sensory deprivation tanks.
Oh, yeah, okay, I'm familiar with the sensory deprivation.
Yeah, well, it's just like really, really salty water, and
Right.
it's like the same temperature as I guess your blood or whatever. So
Right, yeah.
They make it so you go in there and you're weightless, you're floating. You can't really feel the temperature difference between
Right.
your body and the water. So you can't really feel it, and it's pitch
You don't
black.
see anything, you don't hear
Yeah.
anything, you don't feel it. So all five senses are neutral.
Yeah, but people have psychedelic experiences though.
Sure.
Yeah, where they start hallucinating and all this kind of crazy shit happens. So that's kind of like the opposite of what we're talking about: being able to feel your body and be in your body, and then being completely sensory deprived, where you have like this outer body experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's my understanding that people who have experimented with that the potentially beneficial takeaway was that it's like kind of like rebooting your computer. So you create consciousness in this suspended state where it doesn't have this constant bombardment of sensory input, right? And it's just neutral. And then when you come back up, where you're sensing your touch, your taste, all your different senses, then they're not as pre-programmed. What you see and the context changes to some degree, and so what you taste and what you see, and in particular, the meaning and significance of the sensory data is different. That's my understanding of what can be gained out of that sensory deprivation. So yeah, we're doing the exact opposite of tasting the nectar of our own being by neutralizing all that. But then when it reboots, we actually have a healthier and more life-affirming way of experiencing our own being.
That's also what profound psychedelic experiences do, especially I think with psilocybin. Is you get this reboot. It helps a lot with addiction and stuff like that too.
Yeah,
because there's something.
yeah.
It makes your brain more plastic or something. It creates new connections. I guess it enhances like neurogenesis too, the growth of new neurons and stuff like that. So
yeah, the neuron connections, pathways and whatnot, I think are changed. I also think it comes back to what you just said comes back to our reference point of the Buddhist tradition, in some way. But I lost the idea of what that connection was. Darn it.
Yeah, we kind of went off. We started with the Buddhist stuff, and then we kind of went off. And
Yeah, but everything we've talked about still links back. It's still related to or pertains to. It's still part of what the Buddhist tradition pertains to.
yeah, I wanted to lay out the different methods they have and how they correspond to different aspects of the existential stuff we've been talking about for the last 6 episodes or whatever.
Right.
So we had the will one concentration meditation, we had the compassion meditation, the
Right.
visualization of loved ones dying and decaying and stuff like that to help with attachment. Then
Right.
we have the study philosophy, study science, and all that kind of stuff to give you sort of a logical understanding And that logical understanding exists to support experiential sort of insights, to give you sort of a direct sort of experience of reality, or if that's possible. And then we got into, okay, but some of the possible biases associated with that experiential insight stuff is this profundity stuff, and you have to be careful with it.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I guess that was my point.
That was your
Yeah.
Those were your touch points that you wanted to reference.
Yeah.
So this what comes up for me right here is that we're looping back to prior conversation, but boy, the ideas, this is the downside of intuition, is a lot of times it doesn't hold very long. It becomes just a momentary insight that I had there. What was the last item that method that you were talking about there? When you listed off the methods, the last one that you listed was what?
Just the philosophical or scientific like studying to sort of get a logical or rational sort of comprehension of reality.
Right.
So a
cognitive grasp.
Yeah, cognitive grasp, that, but with the ultimate goal of that creating an experiential sort of insight.
Yeah. So it doesn't become a distraction to the direct experience.
Right, it's there to support that experience.
It supports it, and I think that's in the evolution of human consciousness. We're at that place where we haven't got that worked out yet. That it's not normal for us for the majority of us are not constantly aware of that distinction, of the distinction that you just referred to. I have to be careful about pronouns here. The cognitive grasp can be used for good or ill, and it requires the act of will, the choosing as an act of will. And that brought back the lost concept, is that we're at a place in the evolution of human consciousness where our survival requires that we learn how to choose wisely between the two wolves that are fighting. In this case, it's not good or evil, but it's functional and dysfunctional. It's healthy and unhealthy. That we can use in this case, we can use the wolf analogy with the cognitive grasp, that being able to get a mental fix, a conceptual understanding of what's going on, which is all abstract, it's all made up, it's a form of fantasy, right? We can use that as a way to avoid our direct encounter with our sacred relationship with life, or we can use it as a way to enhance the direct experience of reality, of life, particularly with ourself. We can use it as a way to avoid our direct experience, the tasting the richness of my own being. I can use it to avoid that, or I can use it to enhance it. And I have to choose. That's my existential crises of responsibility, because nothing can make that choice for me. I have to, for better or worse, I have to choose how I use the neurotransmitters, the dopamine, just the same way as if I was using a drug. I would be responsible for the context in which I use that drug. Do I use the drug to avoid an encounter with myself, or do I use it to engage the encounter with myself? And I think that's a pretty universal thing for mankind in terms of the evolution of our consciousness, is that we haven't developed that ability very well yet. We're still pretty feeble at making that choice.
So you could, like, for example, if you take the scientific practice, right, to create a hypothesis, test it, and get some sort of result. So there's different motivations for doing that. Like, one could be commercial, right, or for cultural achievement, just to discover something new and get a Nobel Prize or something like that and become recognized. And then there's another level where, you're trying to understand on a cognitive level the nature of reality, right? I think a lot of scientists, they they practice science because they want to gain some sort of understanding about the nature of their field, right?
Yeah.
On an intellectual level. And
Yeah.
then I guess in the Buddhists would say, that these scientific pursuits should ultimately, your ultimate goal would be to have like an experiential insight into the nature of reality and not just understand it on an intellectual level, right?
Right.
And so there's like
Exactly.
different levels. So the content, the scientific data doesn't have to be delusional or made up or something like that. It could be like legit, real scientific data, right? But but even though there's different sort of motivations or different ways to use that.
Well, there's different purposes,
right.
different functions, right?
Right, and I think so.
And so are we? Hang with me here. So are we using the power of science and the profundancy of science, right? Are we using it for mutual well-being, or are we using it for something else? And in some cases, it could be used for self-enrichment at the expense of others, right? Certainly, the science behind marketing is being used that way to a very large extent. Of course, not totally, but again, so it's like each individual is left with the unavoidable responsibility for what they do with their cognitive capacity, with whether using a scientific method or intuition or whatever method for getting a cognitive grasp to understand the nature of themselves and their relationship with everything that's not the self, right? They can use that method as a way to avoid, or we can use it as a way to engage.
Right. In Buddhism, like the fundamental sort of concept is life is suffering, right? And life is suffering because we misunderstand reality. And so therefore, if we can understand reality as it is, we alleviate ourselves from suffering and we obtain nirvana, right? And so their goal of having experiential insight into the nature of reality is that they believe if they can perceive reality accurately, they can overcome suffering and achieve nirvana, right? Yeah, and well, I hope that's true.
Well, I'm confident. I haven't found anything that contradicts that yet, but there's a cross-reference here then to the teachings of Jesus, particularly in and you shall know the truth. He's referencing a circumstance, that under those circumstances ye shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the question that brings up that I don't hear very many people even asking or answering is, free of what?
Suffering.
I mean, it's an incredibly ambiguous statement that in and of itself can't possibly mean anything in particular. But it does create an existential question individually for me to answer for myself. And my answer is, it sets me free from what I'm afraid is true, which for me is a great redemption, a rectification of what the Buddhist tradition is addressing, is the misunderstanding of the nature of reality. Because I misunderstand the nature of reality, I create all kinds of suffering for myself. Because my brain is going to respond to those misunderstandings as if they weren't misunderstood.
It's interesting how much like deep philosophical wisdom is in different religious traditions.
Oh yeah,
and that's the reason why they exist. It's like something in like Joseph Campbell would talk about, these reoccurring, themes, throughout all religion, right? They have to do with trying to trying to take from the subconscious and through narrative and stories create conscious experiential realizations about the nature of reality that overcome suffering and existential crises and all that kind of stuff, but through myth. And then these myths get hijacked by cultures and power structures, and they get manipulated and perverted and stuff.
They're used for unhealthy purposes.
Yeah.
And that goes back then again to the importance of ritual and to be slow in changing your rituals, the changing the beliefs, the conclusions, changing anything about a religious structure. It needs to go very, very slow, because otherwise it gets hijacked very, very quickly. And the one of the huge downsides to Martin Luther with the Protestant movement is, he was asserting that human beings are capable of a direct relationship with the deity, with God, and having the church stand as the in between component, interpreting for us our relationship with God, was short. It came up short that we could actually have a direct experience with God, all of which I agree with. But the results of that is that it had handed license for that interpretation to very naive people who didn't have the support of the tradition of the ancient wisdom, right? Because they weren't confined to that anymore. They could just make it up on their own. And boy, have they.
Mm-hmm.
And I think with I say it with almost any religion, you have people who are using the rhetoric, the ideals, the values, the beliefs, etc., of a religious structure, for the exact opposite of what that seemed to have originally been intended for.
Yeah,
certainly the opposite of well-being.
They're using the myth to create a narrative. Narratives are used to manufacture crowds, and crowds are used to extract power. Yeah.
Well, and not only the crowd, but I think maybe even more relevant is that within my own self, I use narrative to create my own crowd. All that crowd dynamics can happen within one individual. I watch it with myself. How I can become absolutely certain about the accuracy of something that is completely erroneous. And I don't hear any evidence in that state of profundancy, to borrow the term that you took from Nietzsche, but in that state of mind that I'm so convinced, my brain is going to filter out any contradictory evidence of that.
Yeah.
In that intoxicated state. This takes me back to what I just said. Takes me back to a conversation you and I were having, where I was discussing something that was a dopamine generating conversation. And not that I was aware of it at the time, but it was kind of, it's almost like, light it up, man. Let's get high together. But we use words. You and I can use words to get high. Mm-hmm. But what you said is, it's great. You took a pin and just stuck it right in that balloon. You said, yeah, but that's where I get in trouble. And it's like, oh, okay, hold it. Wait a minute. Because where I was going on my own until you brought out your pin and popped the bubble, I was going on this intellectual narrative. Yeah, it was definitely a narrative that I was bringing up, and then you were saying, yeah, but I can get in trouble with that stuff.
Yeah, we were talking about working with inmates and stuff like that.
Right. And the grandness, the grandiosity of what you were doing for those people. And it's an interesting thing, Jason. I still think in a somewhat sober state now, I look back on it, and it's like, in a certain way, man, you were the catalyst for some really significant, life-altering, beneficial kinds of things in people's lives. You were providing them with information, inspiration, and guidance for a very, very different kind of life that they had been stuck in previously to. That's huge. I don't know of anything more profound that we can do for somebody. But it's important. I've since come to understand that I too need to look at that and say, wait a minute, I can get in trouble here. I can get lost in the intoxication
Right.
of abundancy.
What the issue was, is because like these guys, so like 80 something percent of people who make it to prison were involved in the foster care system in some way, right? So that means,
Is that right?
yeah,
Oh my
that
gosh.
means they've experienced profound, abuse, neglect, and stuff as a child, right?
Yeah.
They've been
Yeah.
taken advantage of and something like that. They've been used in all different kinds of ways. Victims become perpetrators, right? So today's prison
Yeah.
population is yesterday's like forgotten children or neglected children. So it's like karma for society. But anyways, the point is, they're very in tune with your intentions. They want to, if you're in it for yourself, your own ego, look at me, how great I am, and I'm using my interactions with them, even if I might be providing a benefit, but it's not a genuine thing, right? And so,
Right.
if you really,
It has an ulterior motive.
right, and so
Yeah.
one of these things is it's a special combination between not just early childhood abuse, but interactions with institutions that leads people to prison, right? Because you could be abused as a kid and never have interactions with like the foster care systems and stuff like that. You're much less likely to end up in prison. The reason, because if I'm abused in my own home, I'm watching sitcoms, I have friends with good families and stuff like that. I have an idea in my head, my situation's fucked up, but good people exist out there, right? Society as a whole is good, and so I don't develop a cynical worldview. To where if you get involved in the foster care system, a lot of kids, they get abused even worse in the foster care system. They get molested, neglected, treated like pieces of garbage, Then these people represent society as a whole. So now, not only is your family corrupted and evil, now society as a whole is corrupted and evil.
Oh, you don't have an alternative.
Right.
Whereas, like with your situation, you had a narrative. You
I had
had a
enough
narrative of a
positive
possibility
people,
of something other than what was going on immediately.
Right. So that become a cynical worldview. The nature of reality, nature of humanity is corrupt. And so, like, different personality types have different ways of coping with that experience, right? Of that insight.
Right. Yeah.
Some of them just do drugs and they commit crimes to support their drug habits and stuff like that. Some of them become part of a counterculture. They still want to gain a sense of self-esteem, but through gangs and other ways, and so they oppose the culture that harmed them. Right? All this kind of stuff. Anyways, if your goal is to make a difference with this population, any kind of holier than thou stuff, any sort of ego gratification type shit, they're going to pick up on that, and so your motivation has to be genuine.
How did you? What was your? Can you describe how you came to that realization that they see that they can see that self-serving element? They pick up on it. Where'd you pick up on them picking up on it?
I think I experienced a lot of the things that they did, in my life, right? And so I have sort of a lot of the same hypervigilance that they do, and so it's easy for me to relate to them, right? So I think a lot of it has to do with seeing myself in them and understanding them, I think, a bit. Because I could have easily been in prison. I should have been in prison. I committed a lot of crimes when I was young.
Statistically, you would have done time.
I got lucky. I didn't get caught for a lot of stuff I did when I was younger, right? So so part of it is just understanding it. But anyways, the whole point is that once the most important thing in changing these people's lives is they experience altruism. Oh, okay, there is such thing as altruism. People can just care about me for that.
You became the representative of an alternative narrative.
Right, that's what you have to do. But you have to be in control of your own bullshit. You can't just be, no, my shit stinks like everyone else. I'm a fucking idiot. I don't really know what I'm doing. Working with people is very ambiguous. So I had to be with them in a very, what's it called? Vulnerable state. Confused. In it with them, right? And so if they see that and then they experience as your motivations are in the right place, then some of them get a little bit of hope about humanity. Okay, then they get hope about themselves.
Well, because you become at least one example, one example of an alternative.
Right.
And I think that, even with all the damage, down underneath that damage is is that instinctual quest for an ally of well-being, someone who gives a shit about us
Yeah.
for who we are. So the cynicism is a way to try and compartmentalize away from that itch, because we've given up on being able to scratch it. But then then somebody over time, because this is something that, again, it's like, how long does it take for the neural system to kind of equalize on its defense mechanism? Like, how long does it take for the squirrel to come out of its burrow? In this case, how long does it take for the abused adult child to not have to defend against the possibility of somebody, of love, of compassion?
Yeah.
That, because isn't it a protection mechanism that they have?
Well, hope for those people, hope is extremely risky.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Right. And so then you just keep showing up with this particular attitude. I would say it's an attitude of deep personal care and concern for mutual well-being, also referred to as love. But you keep showing up coming from that place of love, and then you're taking care of business, you're doing whatever
Practical
you're doing.
Shit,
yeah. And all the transactional stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But that spiritual state of your own ground of being is one of love or compassion. I think is a maybe even a better term,
or like
a better understood
compassion,
term.
Forgiveness, acceptance. That they're worthy of happiness just because they're human beings and they exist. There's no other justification needed, right? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. No justification and no redemption required.
Right. Well, redemption is required, but yeah.
The what?
Redemption is necessary for these guys.
The what's necessary?
Redemption.
Oh, redemption.
Yeah, because these people have murdered people, they've raped people, they've committed burglaries, violence. So you got to factor that in too. So it's a very complicated situation with them.
Yeah, it is. Context matters. The no redemption necessary was in the context of their right for happiness.
Right.
They have a right to pursue, let's say, contentment rather than peace of mind. That as a human being, they are worthy of peace of mind, even with all their transgressions. Redemption, as in the working out what to do with the aftermath of those transgressions.
Yeah, overcoming cynicism,
or sins.
Overcoming the personal cynicism, gaining a sense of hope.
Right.
Leads them into a sense where they want to achieve some sort of redemption. Right. This is where they start working towards redemption. That's when all the work starts to get done.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
But I was wanting to verify the distinction between what I heard you say, that in your coming from a place of love, we want people, our fellow human beings, to be in a safe, a sane, a peace of mind from where they already are.
Oh yeah. Uh-huh.
And that's our intention for them.
Oh yeah, and there's no
which is a very distinct kind of hold. It's like you can't stop feeling like a piece of shit until you work all this other shit out. And the reality of it is that you have to stop feeling like a piece of shit in order to work all this other stuff
exactly.
out. In order to do the redemption. So it's like you have. That's what I meant when I said no redemption required.
You have to have hope that you one day can not be a piece of shit anymore.
Yeah, well,
you might still feel like a piece of shit. Yeah.
Right. And to transcend the low self-esteem that we call being a piece of shit, to transcend that without having to be in denial and pretense.
Yeah.
And like compartmentalizing it away or pretending it didn't happen, or the big one is that it's not my fault.
Yeah.
You know, and in a way, it isn't your fault, but in another way, it's still your
Well, they're
responsibility.
victims, right? They are legitimate
Yeah,
victims, the most of them. But victims
yeah,
becomes a mentality and it becomes an identity, right? And it makes it almost
exactly.
impossible to accept the fact that you yourself are a perpetrator. Because no, you're
Yeah,
just a victim of circumstance, right? And, okay, and
yeah,
so is
yeah.
your perpetrator, right? So it's like, no, it's like, yeah, yeah, that whole victim mentality. That's one of the reasons why I got out of the profession. Because just the whole crazy woke fucking bullshit, and everyone's a victim, and it's a competition. You know,
Yeah,
who's the
yeah,
vote,
yeah,
and they're
yeah.
bringing that and trying to work with these guys and
There,
tell.
so there it is again. That's a living example of what we were talking about theoretically earlier, about how the insight about victimhood, and that there are some things that victims don't have control over, right?
Mm,
And then using that cognitive construct, that conceptual framework, and using it in what looks to me like a self and socially destructive way.
yeah,
You know, the whole excessive woke kind of thing, and you know, turning everybody into a victim so that the people who claim to have the power to save you from your victimhood can now be in control of your life.
so what I tell them like is this. So are you to blame for the things that happened to you when you were a child? And the obvious answer is no. You're not to blame. But then I
Yeah,
say, are you responsible for the things that happened to
that's
you when you were
beautiful,
a child?
Jason.
Yes,
That's
you are.
beautiful.
Right?
Yeah.
Because the word responsibility and the word empowerment are interchangeable. They mean the same thing, right? So that's what
Uh-huh.
we have to teach these guys, right? The more they take responsibility for their lives and things that happen to them in their lives,
It
the more
becomes, that's a
power for they have.
self-empowerment.
Yeah, exactly.
Taking responsibility for where you go from here is self-empowerment,
Yeah,
right?
people try to teach them the opposite of that, though,
Yeah,
because they don't
right.
understand. They have good intentions, but their worldview is diluted.
Well, everybody has to work with the filter that they have,
Yeah.
right? The worldview that they have. I mean, what else can people work with other than, you know, the subjective reality?
Yeah, but I think the society's becoming very radicalized, and yeah, I couldn't work in that environment anymore. I thought it was just getting too crazy and it's counterproductive, and so, but I achieved a lot, and so I was comfortable just moving on to something else.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, and that's life. And that one fits into the Buddhist tradition also.
yeah.
The you know, the letting go and moving on, you know, and the being like water. So,
I think this is a pretty good time.
sh-
We got about hour
yeah,
20
yeah,
in,
yeah.
so that was a good one.
And I think that this is yeah, it was a good one. The word that comes to mind is productive, but that sounds too crass, but certainly meaningful. Our conversation today has been profound without becoming profundant.
There you go.
It's had significance without becoming overly exaggerated.
All right. Well, anyways, thanks for watching. If you made it to the end here, and we'll see you in the next one.
Yeah. Bye, everybody.